Hi guys, hope we've been staying safe and well. Today is the third video that I'm going to do that looks at the language paper 1. And today we're going to have a look at question 4, which is sometimes known as the debate question or the argument question. This one is slightly different to the previous questions which we've had. If you remember, question 1 is a case of fact finding, so it's finding out information. Question 2 is looking specifically at analysis of language. Question 3 is looking at structure. Now, question 4, you are asked to support and challenge a given statement using language analysis. So it's almost like a development of question 2, if you like, taking that little step further, trying to engage with a point of view. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to present some ideas. I'm going to show the question from the sample paper, looking at Jamaica Inn. Again, if you want to get a copy of this, it's available on the AQA website. And if you go to the very end of the past papers, it is the first paper 1, first sample paper for paper 1. So today we're going to have a look at this PowerPoint, and then we'll talk through some ideas and model a response as well. Okay, so to start with, this is the question 4 from the Jamaica Inn paper, which says this: focus this part of your answer on the second part of the source from line 19 until the end. A student, having read this section of the text, said, the writer brings the very different characters to life for the reader. It is as if you are in the coach with them. To what extent do you agree? In your response, you could write about your own impressions of the characters, evaluate how the writer has created these impressions, and support your opinions with references to the text. Now, in this case, this is not you could, this is definitely you should. You need to write about your impressions of the characters that have been made. You need to evaluate how the writer has done that, which includes the language device if possible. And you need to support your opinions with references to the text, ideally a couple of references per paragraph, which are embedded within it. This question's worth 20 marks, so you'll probably spend about 20 minutes, maximum 25 if you have earned some time back from the earlier questions by managing to do them a little bit quicker. A common problem with this question is people referring to outside the stated lines, and we have line 19 to the end as our given lines within this extract. Unlike question 2, they will not give you this extract in front of you, so you'll have to refer back to the extract and make sure that you make it clear which bits you're referring to. So, for example, this extract from line 19 to the end does not include the driver, so any work that you do on the driver would have to be capped, and you would not get the full marks on this because you're not actually answering the question. You're not actually doing what they're asking you to do. So what I've done is, because we've got a shorter extract here, because it's only a certain part, I have trimmed this down, so this is available on the PowerPoint, and I will read this to you. Now, remember, we are looking at the idea that the student argues that the writer makes the characters come alive. The statement is given that the writer brings the very different characters to life as if you are inside the coach with them. Now, we're going to be looking at whether we agree or disagree with this. So as we read this, start to think about, do the characters seem individual, and do the characters seem to come alive? And if they do, how do they do that? Okay? So have a listen. The few passengers huddled together for warmth, exclaiming in unison when the coach sank into a heavier rut than usual. And one old fellow, who'd been up and kept up a constant complaint ever since he joined the coach at Truro, rose from his seat in a fury, and fumbling with the window sash, let the window down with a crash, bringing a shower of rain upon himself and his fellow passengers. He thrust his head out and shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high, petulant voice for a rogue and a murderer, that they would all be dead before they reached Bodmin if he persisted in driving at such breakneck speed. They had no breath left in their bodies as it was, and he, for one, would never travel by coach again. Whether the driver heard him or not was uncertain. It seemed more likely that the stream of reproaches was carried away in the wind, for the old fellow, after waiting a moment, put up the window again, having thoroughly chilled the interior of the coach, and settling himself once more in his corner, wrapped his blanket about his knees and muttered in his beard. His nearest neighbour, a jovial, red-faced woman in a blue cloak, sighed heavily in sympathy, and with a wink to anyone who might be looking and a jerk of her head towards the old man, she remarked for at least the 20th time that it was the dirtiest night she'd ever remembered, and that she had known some, that it was proper old weather and no mistaking it for summer this time. And burrowing into the depths of a large basket, she brought out a great hunk of cake and plunged into it with strong white teeth. Mary Yellen sat in the opposite corner, where the trickle of rain oozed through the crack in the roof. Sometimes a cold drip of moisture fell upon her shoulder, which she brushed away with impatient fingers. She sat with her chin cupped in her hands, her eyes fixed on the window splashed with mud and rain, hoping with a sort of desperate interest that some ray of light would break the heavy blanket of sky, and but a momentary trace of that lost blue heaven that had mantled Helford yesterday shine for an instant as a forerunner of fortune. Okay, so as I'm looking through this, what I decided to do was to think about, okay, if I'm agreeing with the student's statement that the writer brings the very different characters to life, I'm looking for evidence that the characters, their personalities, what ideas are created about them. So I've got the old man, I've got the red-faced woman, and I've got Mary yelling. And I tried to find evidence for each about how they're individual or their personalities. So for the old man, he shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high, petulant voice. He wrapped his blanket around his knees and muttered in his beard. Then we have the jovial red-faced woman, sighed heavily with sympathy and then with a wink, and then plunged into it with strong white teeth. And then with Mary Yellen, we have brushed away with impatient fingers, chin cupped in her hands, her eyes fixed on the window, and hoping with some sort of desperate interest. Now, the only argument I could think of as to how the characters didn't come to life was that they were treated potentially as a collective. So I went for the passengers huddled together for warmth, exclaiming in unison, as in they are treated all as a group. Now, I think that's pretty hard to argue, but we could use this potentially as a point to illuminate one of our characters. This essentially is the 3 paragraphs that I'm going to be trying to do. I'm going to have a go at describing the old man and having a look at what the writer does to make him interesting, the red-faced woman, and Mary Yellen. Now, what I'll do is I'll focus on the old man for our modelled paragraph, but obviously these 2 are where I'll be going with this next. Now, this is the top end of the mark scheme, which we're looking for perceptive and detailed evaluation. In this paragraph, which I'm not going to read the full thing to you, we've got references throughout, including things like the old fellow, petulant, never travel by coach again. These short embedded phrases which are being used and trying to explore how that creates an impression of him as a character and how it makes him interesting. Now, what we're essentially going for is a paragraph that uses the squid model. Now, some people will have this as PEED, which is point, evidence, explain, develop. If you find that PEED is a little bit difficult to remember, or you struggle to remember what each bit is meant to be, squid is also a good way to remember, which is where you find a statement, you make a point about the character or how that's been presented by the writer. You give a quotation where you quote directly from the text. You make an inference about what is implied, which is where you're explaining in your PEED paragraph, and then development, explore one or more possible reader responses to that. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to do a PED or a squid paragraph together, looking at the idea of the old man and using the evidence that I've gathered here, which is shout up to the driver, cursing him in a high petulant voice, wrapped his blanket around his knees and muttered into his beard. Okay, so I'll get rid of that. The first thing we need to do is we need to make a point about the character, and ideally we need to make sure that we are referencing the statement that the student makes, which is the writer brings to life the characters for the reader. It is as if you're inside the coach with them. So in this opening point, I referenced the fact that I'm talking about a statement that the student made. So I said, I wholeheartedly agree with the student that the writer vividly captures the characters within the coach, creating interesting and engaging descriptions to illuminate their personalities. I now need to include some evidence from the old man. So what we can include, the first point potentially we could make about him is his aggressive nature. So we've got shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high petulant voice. Sorry. The old man, for example, aggressive and okay, so what we've got so far here is your point, and here's our evidence. So S is our statement, and Q is our quotation. I wholeheartedly agree with the student that the writer vividly captures the characters within the quote, creating interesting and engaging descriptions to illuminate their personalities. The old man, for example, is presented as aggressive and terrifying in his fury, showing little regard for the other passengers as he, and I've embedded rather than saying, for example, shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high, petulant voice. Now, what we need to do here is we need to now make our inferences. We need to zoom in on particular aspects of the language. So, for example, we might want to look at something to support the idea of being aggressive and terrifying is his shouting and his cursing. So, the choice of verbs such as cursing imply his growing at the driver, suggesting his lack of control and manners compared to other passengers. Or in particular, I'm going to have a look at this idea of it being quite childish. As this argument. Okay, so I'm reading back what we've got so far. Our point, our evidence, our explanation, or our statement, our quote, our inference. I wholeheartedly agree with the student that the writer vividly captures the characters within the quote, creating interesting and engaging descriptions to illuminate their personalities. The old man, for example, is presented as aggressive and terrifying in his fury, showing little regard for the other passengers as he shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high, petulant voice. The choice of verbs such as shouting and cursing imply his growing rage at the driver, suggesting his lack of control and manners compared to the other passengers within the coach. In particular, the adjective petulant suggests he comes across as aggressive, yet also ridiculous, as his argument cannot change this awful weather. Now, finally, we need to develop and show about how this would affect us as a reader, or in Squid, it's also the idea of developing it and talking about the overall effect. So overall, as readers, the language here helps to craft the man's personality and vividly captures his aggression, fury in the coach. Readers, we can not quite done yet. If I read it, the full paragraph now, what we had it is, obviously you can see from the length of the paragraph that the most detailed and important parts are the ideas of looking at the key words and the overall effect on the reader. But what I've got here is this. I wholeheartedly agree with the student that the writer vividly captures the characters within the coach, creating interesting and engaging descriptions to illuminate their personalities. The old man, for example, is presented as aggressive and terrifying in his fury, showing little regard for the other passengers as he shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high petulant voice. The choice of verbs such as shouting and cursing imply his growing rage at the driver, suggesting his lack of control and manners compared to the other passengers within the coach. In particular, the adjective petulant suggests he comes across as aggressive, yet also ridiculous, as his argument cannot change the awful weather. Overall, as readers, the language here helps to craft the man's personality and vividly capture his aggression and fury in the coach. As readers, we can imagine his growing rage at the awful conditions, and we can infer the awkwardness from the other passengers, suggesting their very different personalities. That's a really good example of how you should craft these paragraphs, looking at the idea of making sure you refer to the statement, making sure you're referring back to the ideas that the student came up with. Ideally, you're looking to agree for the majority of the time. Okay, now I hope that's been really, really useful for you. I'm going to stop presenting just for a second. I hope that's been really, really useful for you. Obviously, question 4 is an important one because it's worth so many marks. A lot of students get bogged down in question 2 and question 3 and don't leave themselves enough time to adequately have an attempt at question 4. I would recommend certainly being really, really strict on your timings with that first section. Less than 5 minutes on question 1. Maximum 10 minutes on question 2 and question 3, and then give yourself that 20 minutes on question 4. This is a good one to return to if you finish your writing task early, because there's always more that you can say within this question. And obviously you're aiming for those higher marks. The language analysis, those little tiny steps forward that you can take with the key words are probably the things that are going to push you into the next round, rather than going back and adding extra paragraphs to question 2 and 3, because you're never ever going to get the marginal gains in that sense, if you like. Like I said, I hope that's been really useful. Next video, I'm going to have a look at the writing task, which is obviously quite hard to teach, but I'm going to look at some tips and some ideas that will help to plan and prepare, and ideally a good example of a creative writing piece. So until then, take care and stay safe.